Brother Jake had a cart, and the city of Ypres paid him to fill it. His name sits in the municipal accounts of that Flemish town for the year 1316. A hospital brother attached to the house of Our Lady, and the clerks spelled out plainly what the money bought. He was paid to carry and gather the dead out of the streets. The original French survives, pour faire porter et cueillir les morts aval les rues, and the wording is as flat as any other line in the ledger, right alongside payments for wall repairs and candle wax. A rich cloth town, one of the wealthiest urban centers in Northern Europe, was paying a hospital brother to walk its lanes with a cart and pick up corpses the way another man might be paid to clear fallen branches after a storm. Before his work was done, the tally came to at least 2,794 bodies in roughly 6 months. Most of them were poor people whose surviving relatives, where any relatives survived, could not afford a burial. So the city buried them, wrote the cost into its books, and the books outlasted everyone involved, and that is how we know. 2,794 is the minimum, by the way. A historian named Hans van Verweke went through those accounts line by line in the 1950s and corrected the old accounts, and even he called his figure a floor rather than a ceiling. Roughly 1 person in every 10 who lived in Ypres died in that stretch. And nothing had attacked the city. The weather had simply gone wrong for 2 years running, and winter did the rest. That is the subject tonight. Winter itself. What it actually took to get a family from November to April in medieval Europe, and what happened when they didn't make it. Fair warning before we go any further, this one gets dark. Starvation, frostbite, gangrene, wolves inside city walls, parents burying children, children burying parents, and a few things considerably worse than any of that. If you came for castles and Christmas feasts, some of that is in here too. But mostly, this is about the several months of every single year when the whole continent held its breath and waited to find out who would still be alive at Easter. Before we get into it, welcome in and welcome back if you've been here before. Pour something warm, get under a blanket, you'll want it for this one. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I enjoy scrolling through those. The spread of countries on the last video was wild. A huge thank you to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members. If you'd like to join them, the links for both are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, back to the 14th century. Start with the calendar, since medieval people did. For a peasant family, and that meant the overwhelming majority of everyone alive, the year did not begin in January. It began with the harvest, and everything after the harvest was a countdown. Whatever came out of the fields in August and September had to last until the following summer. Whatever animals could not be fed through the cold months had to die in November. The whole autumn was one long act of triage, deciding what would live, what would be eaten, what would be salted, and what would be gambled on. The Anglo-Saxons had a name for November that tells you everything about how this felt. Bede, the monk from Jarrow, writing in the early 700s, recorded the Old English months in his book on time, and November was Blot Moneth, blood month, the month of slaughter, when the cattle that could not be overwintered were killed, and, in the pagan centuries before Bede's own time, dedicated to the old gods as they died. Even after the religion changed, the killing stayed on the same schedule because the schedule was set by grass, not by faith. Grass stops growing, hay runs out. You cannot feed 12 animals through the snow on fodder that will barely keep 4 alive. So 8 of them die in November, and the family spends weeks up to their elbows in blood and salt. Martinmas, the feast of St. Martin on the 11th of November, became the traditional slaughter date across much of Europe. In England, salted beef put up at that time of year was called Martlemas beef, and having plenty of it hanging in your house was proverbial for being set up well for the winter. The salting itself was brutal, tedious work. Meat was rubbed with salt or packed in brine, hung in the smoke above the hearth and checked constantly. One badly cured joint could rot and take your protein supply for February with it. Salt was expensive too. During the worst years, we have records of the price of salt more than doubling, because the same miserable wet weather that ruined the grain also made it nearly impossible to evaporate seawater in the salt pans along the coast. Wet years attacked the food, and then attacked the only means of preserving what food remained. People at the time noticed that pairing, and you can feel a certain despair underneath the price lists. So the house, by early December, looked like this. Sacks of grain, if the harvest had been decent, peas and beans dried hard as gravel, onions, leeks, cabbages that could stand in the ground a while, a flitch or two of bacon in the rafters if the family was doing well, cheese made back when the cows still gave milk, ale brewed from part of the barley. Everything the family would eat for roughly half a year, sitting in one room where they could look at it. And they did look at it. They counted it constantly. Every meal was a small subtraction from a number everyone in the household carried in their heads, and no one had to explain to the children what it meant when the number got low too early. The meals themselves were monotonous in a way modern people can barely conceive of. Pottage, mostly. A pot hanging over the fire more or less permanently, filled with water, oats or barley, dried peas, whatever vegetables were left, a scrap of bacon for flavour if the family had any. It simmered all day, got eaten, got topped up, and simmered again. Bread alongside it when there was grain to spare for baking, and the bread of the poor was nothing like ours. Maslin, a mix of wheat and rye or barley bread, or in the hard north, bread cut heavily with oats. Coarse, heavy, grey-brown stuff. And in bad years, the definition of bread got very loose. Ground peas and beans went into the flour, bran that would normally feed the pig, acorns gathered and soaked to draw out the bitterness, then dried and milled. In the Nordic countries, families stripped the inner bark from pine and birch trees, dried it, ground it, and stretched their flour with that. Bark bread shows up in medieval Scandinavian sources as an ordinary famine food, a normal thing that everyone understood, the way we understand instant noodles at the end of a rough month. Except that a person can live on instant noodles. Bark fills the stomach and quietly fails to feed you, and the people eating it mostly knew that and ate it anyway, since a full stomach that is starving feels better than an empty one that is starving. City authorities knew about the tricks bakers pulled when grain got scarce, and the court records are grim comedy. Bakers in London and Paris were fined for padding loaves with sand, with bran, with floor sweepings. One London punishment for selling bad or fraudulent bread involved dragging the baker through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf tied around his neck, so the whole city could see exactly which man had tried to make money off hunger. Crowds enjoyed that spectacle a great deal, and given what a bad loaf could mean for a family with nothing else, the anger behind the enjoyment was not abstract. Even in a normal year, though, the stores ran down faster than the winter did, and everyone knew the truly dangerous stretch came at the far end. Late February, March, April, into May. The stored grain nearly gone, the salted meat gone or reduced to rinds, the garden dead, the new crops months from ripening, the cows not yet giving milk. English country people called it the hungry gap, and the phrase survived into modern gardening books, where it now describes a mild inconvenience about salad greens. In the 1300s, it described the annual season of watching your children get thinner. Spring in the medieval countryside was famine season. That inversion catches people off guard. We think of winter as the deadly stretch and spring as relief, but the parish burial records, where they survive, tend to bulge in late spring, when bodies weakened by 4 months of shrinking rations finally gave out just as the world turned green around them. Dying of hunger in April, with blossom on the trees, was a completely ordinary medieval death. Everything else in this story is that annual rhythm going wrong, the countdown, the slaughter, the shrinking sacks, the gap at the end. Sometimes slightly wrong, and old people died. Sometimes catastrophically wrong, and Brother Jake got hired. Now the house itself, since the house was the whole battlefield. Most families in medieval Northern Europe lived in a single room. The classic form was the longhouse, and versions of it existed from Ireland to the Baltic. One long rectangular building, timber-framed, walls of wattle and daub, woven sticks packed with a plaster of mud, dung and straw, all of it under a deep thatched roof. On Dartmoor in southwest England, where the stone versions survive well enough to walk through, the layout is beautifully clear. A single door opens into a cross passage. Turn one way and you are in the human end, a hall with a hearth. Turn the other way and you are in the ship-on, the byre, where the cattle stood tethered through the winter with a stone drain running down the middle to carry the muck away. One roof, one door, people at the top of the slope, animals at the bottom, so that gravity took the urine downhill and away from the beds. Sharing your home with cattle sounds unbearable until you spend one January night in an unheated stone building, at which point it starts sounding like genius. A cow puts out heat like a small furnace. Several cows, penned a few steps from where the family slept, raised the temperature of the whole structure by degrees that could genuinely mean the difference between a cold night and a fatal one. The price was everything you would expect. The smell of the byre soaked into every fibre of clothing and every mouthful of food. Flies in the warm months, lice and fleas in all months. The soft, constant noise of large animals shifting in the dark. Disease moving between species in both directions. Medieval people were not oblivious to any of this. They simply did the math that mattered. Warmth against stink, and warmth won every single time. Nobody romantic has ever had to choose between dignity and body heat in February. The hearth sat in the middle of the floor, an open fire on a stone or clay base with no chimney. Chimneys existed. They show up in castles and fine townhouses from around the 1100s onward. But for the ordinary rural family, they remained an unaffordable luxury deep into the period and past the end of it. Smoke from the hearth rose into the roof space and found its way out through the thatch, through a gap at the gable, through a louver if the family had one. Which means the family lived all winter inside a smokehouse. The historian Ian Mortimer describes walking into a hall like this and finding every surface coated black with soot, the air thick enough to sting your eyes at standing height, clearer down low where people actually sat. Small children learned young to keep their heads down, literally, and the lungs paid for all of it. Skeletons from medieval villages show rates of sinus infection and chronic respiratory damage that trace straight back to a lifetime of breathing wood smoke in an enclosed space. Winter coughs settled into winter bronchitis, bronchitis settled into pneumonia, and pneumonia in a world without antibiotics killed the old and the very young with total reliability. The fire that kept a family alive was also, slowly and quietly, taking years off every life in the room. A fair trade, given the alternative, but a trade all the same. The fire had one more way to kill, and it worked fast. A hearth banked down for the night in a badly ventilated room, on a still night when no draft pulled the fumes upward, filled the air with carbon monoxide. People simply did not wake up. Whole families, some mornings. Medieval sources could not name the gas, but they knew the pattern, and coroners' rolls record households found dead together with the fire out and no mark on any of them. Neighbors called it the damp or bad air or judgment, depending on temperament. The mechanism had no name for another 5 centuries. The bodies looked asleep. Around that hearth, the family arranged its nights like a puzzle. Beds were expensive, so most households had 1, maybe 2, and everyone shared. Parents, children, sometimes a grandparent, sometimes a servant or a lodger, all in one bed or on straw pallets pulled close to the banked fire, under blankets of wool, under cloaks, under each other's arms. Bed sharing carried its own rules and its own dangers, and the church courts heard cases about infants smothered by exhausted parents rolling over in the night, often enough that priests preached against taking babies into the parental bed at all. Mothers took them in anyway, an infant in a cradle across the room, in a house where the water froze indoors, was an infant at risk of a much more certain death than smothering. That is the shape of nearly every winter choice these people faced. Both options were dangerous. You picked the danger that killed more slowly, and sometimes you still lost. Clothing followed the same logic of layers and compromise. Wool, wool, and more wool. A linen shirt or shift against the skin, linen being smoother and easier to wash than a wool tunic or gown, wool hose, a wool hood that covered the shoulders, a cloak on top. The wealthy lined all of it with fur, squirrel, and rabbit for the merely comfortable, sable and ermine for the great. The poor lined it with nothing and wore it until it fell apart. Shoes were leather, thin-soled, endlessly patched, and a family's children often went without in any season where bare feet were survivable, to save the shoes for when they weren't. Chilblains were universal. Those burning, itching sores that come up when cold, damp skin is warmed too fast at a fire, and every medieval hand and foot in the north probably carried them from November through March. Painful, ugly, healing badly, one more low ache underneath everything, the background noise of the season. Water froze in the bucket by the door. Bread froze hard enough to need an axe in the worst spells, and one chronicler complained of wine freezing in the cask and being sold by the chunk. Ink froze while monks tried to write, and a few of them left marginal notes complaining about exactly that. Tiny, frozen-fingered messages across 8 centuries, some of them quite funny. One writes that his hand is so cold he can barely form the letters, then keeps going for another 200 pages. People still had to work through all of it. Animals needed feeding and mucking out every single day. Firewood needed splitting daily. Grain needed threshing through the winter, beating the ears with flails in the barn, dusty, exhausting work that at least warmed you up. Repairs, spinning, mending, tool-making. The idea of hibernating through the cold months was a fantasy nobody could afford, though people did sleep enormously long hours in winter, 10, 12 hours in the dark, waking in the middle of the night for a quiet hour, then sleeping until a late dawn. When light costs money, and candles were money, darkness makes your schedule for you. Everything in that house depended on fuel, and fuel is where the law walked into the story with a knife. Firewood does not sound like a legal matter to us. In medieval England it absolutely was, and the stakes were mutilation. After the Norman conquest, William and his successors declared enormous stretches of the country royal forest, and forest in the legal sense did not mean woodland, it meant land under forest law, whether trees grew on it or not. By the late 1200s, something like a third of England fell under that jurisdiction. Whole counties, villages included, farms included, people included. Within the forest, the deer and the boar belonged to the king, and so, in a meaningful sense, did the trees. Ordinary people held customary rights, and those rights had lovely old names. Estovers, the right to take wood for fuel and repairs. Fireboat, specifically wood for the hearth. Houseboat for building. Hedgeboat for fencing. But the rights were limited, supervised, and usually confined to dead wood, windfall branches, what a person could pull down by hook or by crook. And yes, that is apparently where the phrase comes from, the hook and the crook being the tools you were permitted to use on standing trees. Anything more, cutting a living tree, taking green timber, and you were in front of the forest courts. The punishments in the early period were designed to be remembered. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in its bitter obituary of William the Conqueror, says he loved the tall deer as if he were their father, and that whoever killed a hart or a hind was to be blinded. Under the forest assizes of the late 1100s, killing the king's deer could cost you your eyes and your testicles, both. That was the formal tariff for a poached deer, a creature the starving family in our longhouse could watch stepping through the snow outside their door, fat, edible, and untouchable. Chopping down a tree without right could cost a hand. In the counties under forest law, a father in a freezing January stood between two facts. His children were cold, and the wood all around him belonged to someone who would maim him for taking it. Magna Carta, And then the Charter of the Forest in 1215 and 1217 formally ended death and mutilation as forest penalties, and that charter stayed on the books longer than almost any law in English history. After it, the punishment became fines, or a year and a day in prison for those who could not pay. Better, certainly. But look at what a fine meant to a family already deciding which meals to skip, and the prison at somewhere like Goodrich Castle still held men whose entire crime was a snared rabbit. Where the foresters could not identify the culprit, they could find the whole village collectively, so your neighbour's desperation became your bill. The records of the forest ayers, the travelling courts, are full of small, sad cases. A widow taking branches, boys caught with a dead hare, men found with venison who claim they found the deer already dead, which occasionally was even true, and good luck proving it. Where wood was short, people burned what they had. Peat, cut from the bogs in summer, dried in stacks, burned slow and smoky through the winter, the fuel of whole regions from Ireland to the Netherlands. Dried animal dung in the treeless places, gorse and furze, bracken, heather, straw, beanstalks, anything. The very poorest gathered by gleaning hedgerows and verges, and one of the reliable signs of a hard winter in the records is a spike in prosecutions for wood theft. Hedges stripped, fences vanishing overnight, fruit trees disappearing from orchards. A fence is tomorrow's problem. Tonight it is fuel. And when the fuel ran out entirely, the family had the animals, each other, and prayer, roughly in that order of usefulness. All of this, remember, describes an ordinary winter that behaved itself. The season had moods far beyond ordinary, and the chronicles kept score of the terrible ones the way we keep records of hurricanes. Some winters got names, some got remembered for a century. A few changed the course of politics, and one of them sits underneath one of the most famous scenes in all of medieval history, so I'll tell it properly. January of 1077. The German king Henry IV had been excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII. His nobles were circling, and his crown depended on reaching the Pope in northern Italy and begging forgiveness before a deadline. Between Henry and the Pope stood the Alps, in what the chronicler Lambert of Hersfeld describes as the most savage winter in living memory. The Rhine froze solid from November to March, hard enough to walk across for months, and men, Lambert says, crossed it as if it were dry land. Henry took his wife Bertha, their small son, and a modest company up over the Mont-Cenis Pass in the dead of that season. Local guides who knew the mountain took them roped together up the ice. The descent on the far side was worse than the climb. The men slid down the frozen slopes on their hands and knees, or crawled or fell and rolled. The horses could not manage it at all, so some were lowered on ropes, and others were tied and dragged, and a number of them died on the way down, broken on the ice. The Queen and the ladies of her party were wrapped in ox hides and pulled down the mountainside like sledges, bumping down the ice inside the skins of dead cattle, an empress of the Romans delivered into Italy as luggage. Henry arrived at the castle of Canossa and stood barefoot in the snow, in penitent's wool, for 3 days before Gregory let him in. Standing barefoot in the snow of the coldest winter anyone could remember was the entire point of the performance. Everyone watching understood the currency being spent. Everyone watching knew exactly what that cold did to feet. Winters like that one recur through the record at unpredictable intervals, and each brings its own crop of marvels and corpses. In 1323, the Baltic Sea froze, properly froze, from coast to coast. A German chronicle records that from St. Andrew's Day, at the end of November until the middle of Lent, riders and carts crossed the open sea on the ice between Germany and Denmark and on towards Sweden, and that inns were set up on the ice itself, out on the frozen sea, where travellers halfway across could stop for food and beer. A warm room with a fire, serving drinks, standing on the surface of the Baltic, with the water somewhere down in the dark underneath the floorboards. Merchants treated it as a road. Roads, though, do not thaw, and the sources on these frozen crossings, here and elsewhere, carry a steady undercurrent of the other outcome, the cart that went through, the ice that boomed and opened, travellers who left one shore and never made either. Drowning under ice was among the worst deaths on offer in a period with a rich menu of them. The current carries you away from the whole. The light is above you, the ice is a ceiling, and the cold takes your ability to move within a couple of minutes. Coroners' records from England are full of humbler versions, children through pond ice, women through the mill race fetching water, men taking the shortcut across the river they had crossed safely all week. Up in the far north, to be fair, people had long since made their peace with ice and even put it to work. Scandinavia and the Baltic lands treated hard freezes as infrastructure. A frozen river or lake is the best road those landscapes ever get, flat, smooth, and running exactly where the boats run in summer. Sledge traffic in a Norwegian or Russian winter moved goods faster and cheaper than the summer roads ever could. Markets timed themselves to the freeze, and the winter road across a given lake was an institution with known entry points and known bad spots, marked with pine boughs stuck in the ice, maintained the way another country maintains bridges. The same communities also kept the other ledger. The sledges lost, the horses gone through, the funerals held in spring for bodies the lake gave back at thaw, and northern folklore is dense with beings that live under the ice and pull people down, and that is what a safety briefing looks like when it has to survive by being told to children. The winter of 1363 into 64 may have been the most extreme of the entire era, and climate historians who compare the sources rank it above even the famous frozen winters of later centuries. The freeze began in early December and did not release until the end of March, 4 months. The Rhone froze at its mouth, where it meets the Mediterranean. The lagoon of Venice froze. The Atlantic coast near Bordeaux froze. Salt water, open ocean shoreline, ice. The Rhine at Mainz stood frozen for about 70 days. And at Cologne the citizens gave up pretending and held their market out on the river. Southern French sources describe olive trees and vines killed to the root, and the death of an olive grove is a quiet economic wound that bleeds for a generation, the trees taking decades to replace. Nobody counted the human dead of a winter like that across a whole continent. The counting apparatus did not exist. What we get instead are the local glimpses, parishes recording burial surges, towns recording the poor found dead, and the phrase that repeats across sources in a dozen languages, a cold such as no man living could remember. England's turn came with the winter of 1407 into '08, remembered simply as the Great Frost. Snow fell heavily and then kept falling on and off for months. The Thames froze from London down to Gravesend and stayed frozen for more than 14 weeks, which took it deep into spring. Carts crossed the river as if it were a street, and Londoners walked out onto the ice to gawk at their own bridge from below, the great stone bridge whose 19 narrow arches, choked with houses and water wheels, had slowed the current enough to help the freeze take hold in the first place. The bridge that made London rich helped ice over the river that made the bridge worth building, and the boatmen, the whole ferrying trade of the Thames, sat on the bank for 14 weeks watching their livelihood function as a footpath. The Grey Friars Chronicle of London and other sources record one detail from that winter that stays with you longer than the statistics might. The small birds died. Thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, in uncountable numbers, of hunger and cold together. A frost that seals the ground for 100 days seals it for every creature that feeds from it. People found the fields and hedges littered with them. In 1410, another 14-week frost killed the wildfowl. In 1434, the Thames locked up again from late November until St. Valentine's Day, and once more the sources pause to note the multitude of birds dead of hunger. When a chronicler whose daily business is kings and battles stops to record dead sparrows, the sparrows were everywhere. A frozen river brought one more problem that rarely occurs to modern people, and it hit towns squarely in the stomach. Mills. Nearly all the grinding of grain in medieval Europe happened at watermills, and a watermill on a frozen river is a statue. During the long frosts, the wheels locked in the ice, the mill races stood solid, and towns holding perfectly adequate stocks of grain suddenly could not turn any of it into flour. Sources from the Great Frost years describe exactly this bind. Corn in the granaries and no bread in the ovens, households falling back on hand querns, the ancient rotary stones that ground a day's flour in an hour of hard labour, and bakers rationing what the windmills and horse mills could supply. Water itself became a chore with teeth in it. Town conduits froze. Wells froze at the surface and had to be broken open every morning. The women and children whose job was fetching water worked at holes chopped in river ice, on sloped, glazed banks, and the coroners collected the results of that all winter. Even firefighting, the terror of every timber town, got worse in a hard frost, since a January house fire met bucket chains dipping from holes in the ice, and more than one medieval town burned in weather cold enough to freeze the water they threw at it. Fish ponds froze to the bottom and killed the stock that was supposed to feed Lent. Saltwater fish stayed offshore past the reach of small boats in the storm months, so the fasting seasons leaned on the stockfish trade, wind-dried cod from Norway, hard as planks, beaten with hammers before cooking, and one of the quiet dependencies of the whole medieval winter was that chain of dried fish stretching down from the Arctic, feeding a continent through the months when its own waters gave nothing. Behind the frozen rivers and the dead birds sits the plain physiology, the mechanism underneath half the deaths in this story, and a few unflinching minutes on it will make everything after it clearer. Cold kills a human being in stages, and medieval people watched every stage happen to their neighbors without any of our vocabulary for it. It starts with shivering, the body burning fuel to shake heat into itself, and a starving body has very little fuel to burn, so the poor and the hungry lost this fight faster, always. As the core temperature drops, the shivering becomes violent, then, ominously, it stops. The muscles no longer have anything left to spend. Thinking goes strange around this point. Speech slurs, judgment dissolves, people become confused, clumsy, weirdly calm, and stop understanding that they are dying. And this stage explains so many of the deaths in the records. The traveller who sat down in the snow a mile from the village, the man found in the ditch beside a road he had walked his whole life. Sitting down feels reasonable. Sleep feels reasonable. In the final stage, some victims feel burning hot, and modern rescue teams still find people who died of cold with their coats pulled open, and versions of that scene show up in older accounts too, frozen bodies strangely undressed, which onlookers at the time explained in whatever way made sense to them. The heart, cooled far enough, simply loses its rhythm and stops. From the outside, the person appears to fall asleep in the snow and not wake up. From the inside, mercifully, that is close to what it feels like at the end, after a beginning that is anything but merciful. Frostbite worked slower and, for survivors, arguably worse. Fingers, toes, ears, noses, the parts farthest from the heart went numb, then white and hard, then, after warming, purple and black. Blisters filled with blood. Flesh died on the living body. If the freeze was shallow, the dead skin peeled and left scarred, forever cold-sensitive stumps of tissue. If it was deep, the finger or the foot mummified, dried, blackened, and had either to be cut off or left to detach on its own, and both of those happened in medieval Europe, in cottages, without anesthetic, with a knife the family also used for food. Barber surgeons could take off a rotten foot with reasonable skill and a leather strap to bite on, and infection killed a large share of the patients afterward, regardless of the skill involved. Every village had its people made partial by winters past, the shepherd short 3 fingers, the old woman with half a foot. Walking reminders every single year of what the season could collect if you let it catch you out of doors. And who did it catch? The pattern in the records is brutally consistent, and it is a pattern of poverty first. Beggars and vagrants sleeping in church porches, in haystacks under bridges, found stiff in the morning. The old, in poorly heated houses, dying in bed in January of the pneumonia the cold invited in. Newborns above everything. A baby loses heat catastrophically fast, and a winter birth in an unheated room was a gauntlet, run before the child was an hour old. Winter childbirth concentrated everything the season did to the vulnerable into a single night. A medieval woman delivered at home, attended by neighbors and a midwife if one could be fetched through the snow, in a room heated by one fire. And the birth itself carried all its usual dangers: hemorrhage, obstruction, fever afterward, with the cold stacked on top. A newborn is a tiny, wet creature with no reserves at all, losing heat faster than any adult body ever will. and the first hour of a January birth in a peasant house was a race. The child dried and bound and put skin to skin, swaddled hard, kept at the fire, kept in the bed. And even so, parish records and skeleton counts agree that winter babies died at rates far above summer ones. Baptism law bent around the danger, since a child dead unbaptized was a child lost in the next world as well as this one. So midwives everywhere held emergency authority to baptize a failing newborn on the spot. Water and the formula, spoken by a farm woman with bloody hands in a dark room. The one sacrament the church trusted to lay people precisely because winter and childbirth so often refused to wait for a priest. Then the workers whose jobs put them outside. Shepherds stand out here. Sheep in much of Europe overwintered on open ground, and someone had to be with them, especially in lambing weather. And the sources across centuries carry the same repeating tragedy. A blizzard, a missing shepherd, a search, and a man found days later in the lee of a wall with his dog beside him, sometimes with the surviving sheep gathered around, having pressed close to the only warm thing in the landscape as it stopped being warm. Carters and travellers froze on the roads between towns. Pilgrims froze on the passes. Messengers froze with their letters on them, and one or two such letters survive, delivered late by the men who found the body. A strange thing to sit with, the correspondence outliving the courier by the width of a snowstorm. Travel in general became a gamble that respectable people simply declined unless something forced them out. Roads vanished under snow, landmarks vanished, fords became lethal, bridges became ice chutes, and darkness fell in the afternoon. Anyone benighted between villages faced a night outdoors, and a night outdoors in a hard frost, in wool soaked from the day's walking, was frequently a death sentence carried out by morning. Coroner's rolls from medieval England, dry little documents recording sudden deaths for the crown, preserve them by the hundred. Found dead in the snow, perished of cold on the heath, died in the water beneath the ice. The entries are 2 lines each. Each one was somebody's worst day of that entire winter, and the clerk spent 40 words on it and moved on to a drowning. The freezing years took the livestock too, and the loss of animals meant far more than the loss of meat. The winter of 1464 into 65 is one of several remembered specifically for killing cattle and sheep in great numbers, beasts dead in the fields, dead in the folds, frozen where they stood or starved when the fodder ran out weeks before the grass came. A cow was a peasant family's milk, cheese, butter, calves, and capital, all in one animal. An ox was the plough, and without the plough next year's food does not get planted. Sheep were wool, and wool was the rent. When a bad winter went through a village's animals, the human death toll came the following year, on a delay, in the shape of a harvest that never got properly sown and debts that never got paid. Winter had a long reach. It could kill you 14 months after it ended. The cold could reach kings as well, or at least their armies, and campaigning in winter was a form of slow mass suicide that commanders kept committing anyway. Soldiers on winter campaign died of exposure in numbers that routinely dwarfed their battle losses, and one example will stand for the rest. Edward III's burnt Candlemas raid into Scotland in 1356. a February campaign of deliberate burning that ended with the English army starving and freezing its way home through country it had itself destroyed, losing men and horses to the cold along the whole retreat. An army in winter was thousands of underfed men in wet wool sleeping on the ground, and the ground collected its toll. Chroniclers describing such campaigns fall back on the same inventory: horses dead, wagons abandoned, men left where they lay. The season did not care whose banner was overhead. Underneath every one of these deaths, the individual traveler, the shepherd, the sentry, ran a simple equation of food and heat. A fed body resists cold remarkably well. A starving body cannot. Digestion is the furnace, and an empty furnace heats nothing, and this is why famine and frost, arriving together, multiplied each other so viciously. Cold people burn through their food faster, hungry people freeze faster. Each condition feeds the other in a spiral, and medieval Europe got caught in that exact spiral on a continental scale more than once. The worst of those episodes is coming shortly, and it will occupy the heart of this video. The first one, though, predates it by 2 generations, and it started, of all places, on a tropical island on the far side of the planet. 1257 is the year a volcano called Samalas, part of the Rinjani complex on the island of Lombok, in what is now Indonesia, tore itself apart in one of the largest eruptions of the last several thousand years. Modern volcanologists only pinned down the source in 2013, matching sulfur spikes in ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica to the shattered mountain, and the numbers they published are difficult to hold in your head. Tens of cubic kilometers of rock and magma thrown out. An eruption column reaching some 40 kilometers, well into the stratosphere. The largest injection of volcanic sulfur into the sky in over 2,000 years of ice core records. On Lombok, a written tradition on palm leaves remembers a kingdom buried and its capital lost under the ash. And around the whole planet, the sky changed. That veil of sulfur circled the globe, dimmed the sun, and stole the following summers. Europe knew nothing of Lombok. Europe only knew that the weather broke. The English chronicler Matthew Paris, writing at St. Albans, describes the year 1258 in tones of bewildered misery. A north wind that blew for months, frost and snow deep into spring, flowers that never opened until June, crops that rotted or never ripened at all. The harvest failed, and the price of grain went beyond the reach of the poor, and then beyond the reach of almost everyone. What followed in London is one of the best documented mass death events of the entire century. And we have it from 2 directions at once, from the writers who watched it and from the ground itself. The written account first. The City Chronicle records that in that year the famine grew so severe that people came in from the countryside seeking food, villages emptying into a capital that had nothing for them. People ate horseflesh, the bark of trees, and worse. The dead began to accumulate in the streets faster than they could be buried, swollen with hunger, the Chronicle says, lying in the lanes and on the dunghills. It offers a figure of many thousands dead in London alone, 15,000 by one reckoning, in a city of perhaps 50 or 60,000. In April of 1258, the Crown quietly issued orders to sheriffs in the eastern counties to bury the dead paupers without holding the usual inquests. The paperwork of sudden death, the system built to investigate every corpse found in a ditch, had collapsed under volume. When a government suspends its own death investigations to speed up burial, the scale has passed anything its institutions were built for. Now the ground. Between the 1990s and 2007, archaeologists excavating the old cemetery of the Hospital of St Mary Spital under Spitalfields Market in East London uncovered more than 10,000 burials, one of the largest archaeological body counts anywhere in Europe. Among them lay mass burial pits, dozens of them holding thousands of the dead, and radiocarbon dating placed a huge group of those pits in the mid-1250s, right on top of the famine year. For a long time, everyone assumed pits like that meant plague, but the Black Death was 90 years in the future. These were the hunger dead of 1258, the actual people from the Chronicles streets, and the pits carry one detail that changes the whole feeling of the site. Even at the bottom of a famine pit holding strangers, the dead lay shrouded, arranged, heads to the east in the proper Christian manner, side by side in rows. Somebody, in the middle of a city that was actively starving, stood in those trenches and laid each corpse out correctly, one after another, thousands of times. The city was drowning in its dead and still refused to treat them as refuse. Whatever else was breaking down that year, that particular thing did not break. Osteologists who examined the skeletons found what famine leaves in bone: interrupted growth in children, the etched lines of arrested development in teeth, the lesions of anemia and chronic malnutrition. A significant share of the dead were young, refugee children from the countryside most likely, who walked to London because London was where the food was supposed to be, and died there when it wasn't. The city fed who it could. Ships eventually arrived with grain from Germany, and the Chronicle says plainly that without them many thousands more would have died. Relief came by sea, late, and the pits at Spitalfields hold everyone it came too late for. Volcanic winters like the one Somalis threw over the world have a signature: a couple of ruined years, then recovery. What began at the very start of the 1300s was different, slower and permanent on the scale of human lives. Climate historians call it the transition into the Little Ice Age, the comfortable centuries, the long, warm stretch that had let vineyards grow in England and let Norse farmers work land in Greenland, were ending. Solar activity slid into a deep lull that would last decades. Glaciers in the Alps began advancing, swallowing pastures and, eventually, whole alpine hamlets, slowly enough that people could watch the ice come toward houses their grandparents built. Average temperatures dropped by margins that sound trivial, a degree less than a degree, until you learn what a degree does to a growing season at the latitude of Scotland or Norway. It shortens it by weeks. It pushes the line of viable farming south and downhill. Every farm at the margin, and medieval expansion had pushed farms onto every margin available, went from difficult to impossible. Nobody alive in 1310 knew they were standing at the front edge of 5 centuries of cold. They only knew the rains when the rains came. They came in the spring of 1315, and in a sense they did not stop for 2 years. Across the whole of northern Europe, from Ireland east to Poland, from the Alps north to the Baltic, the summer of 1315 dissolved into rain, ordinary undramatic rain, week upon month, through May, through June, through the harvest and past it. Fields flooded and stayed flooded, grain rotted standing up. What could be cut could not be dried, and wet grain moulders in the barn. Hay could not be made, so the animals faced winter with nothing. The salt pans failed. Ploughed hillsides washed into the valleys, and in places the topsoil itself, the accumulated fertility of centuries, slid off the fields and was gone. Chroniclers reached for Noah, of course they did. It rained through the summer, and everyone watched the harvest die in the mud, and everyone did the same terrible calculation about the winter ahead, and the calculation was correct. Prices tell the first part of the story with horrible clarity. Wheat that sold for around 5 shillings a quarter before the rains hit 20 shillings in England by the spring of 1316, and in some markets it touched 40 before vanishing from sale entirely. For past a certain point, the people holding grain stopped selling it at any price. Salt more than doubled. Oats, the poor man's grain, multiplied several times over. Wages did not move, and a labourer earning perhaps a penny and a half a day was suddenly living in a world where a single loaf could swallow most of it. The famine sorted the population by wealth with mechanical precision, and it started eating from the bottom. Governments tried what governments try. Edward II's council, watching the markets in early 1315, issued an ordinance fixing maximum prices for basic foodstuffs. Oxen, pigs, sheep, poultry, eggs, all capped at decreed levels. And it went about the way price caps in a famine have gone every time since. Sellers holding animals worth double the legal price simply stopped bringing them to market. Food vanished from open sale into private deals, and within a year the ordinance was repealed at the request of the very parliament that had wanted it, on the frank grounds that it had made things worse. The Crown tried buying grain overseas as well, from Gascony, from the Mediterranean, and some of it even arrived, though ships coming up the coast with food in a starving country attracted attention, and the records include cargoes seized, cargoes plundered in port, and royal purveyors mobbed. The church, for its part, ordered processions, barefoot penance, the ringing of bells and giving of alms, and framed the rain as the discipline of heaven on a sinful generation. People took part in enormous numbers, walked barefoot behind relics through wet streets, and the rain, chroniclers noted with a certain exhaustion, continued. Our best English witness is a monk named Johannes de Trokelove at St. Albans, and his account of these years has the specificity of a man describing things happening outside his own gate. Meat and eggs disappeared first, he says. Capons and fowl could not be found. The animals were dying of murrain, and swine could not be kept for the impossible price of fodder. Then he reports something that must have travelled through the whole country as gossip within days. In the summer of 1315, King Edward II stopped at St. Albans, and the town could not find bread for the royal household. The King of England, at the head of the richest purchasing operation in the realm, went short of bread. Whatever was happening in the cottages, that one detail measured it for everyone. Down in those cottages, the descent followed a sequence that famine scholars can trace across the sources almost step by step, every family running out of options in roughly the same order. First the stores went, eaten faster than planned when the autumn work provided nothing new. Then the seed grain, the sack every farming family kept sacred, the grain that existed only to be planted. Eating your seed grain is eating next year, and every family that did it understood exactly what they were doing, and thousands of families did it anyway, Children have to be fed in February, even if it guarantees a hungrier February to come. The plough beasts went next, the oxen sold or slaughtered, capital eaten as food. Then the strange foods begin appearing in the record: roots, grasses, nettles, bark. Cats and dogs, openly, and Trocolo notes that horseflesh became precious, which for medieval Christians carried an extra sting, horse being food the church had long frowned upon, food with a whiff of paganism about it, and now it was a luxury. Up at Berwick on the Scottish border, a garrison account from February of 1316 shows soldiers boiling the flesh off horses that had died of hunger, drawing the line only at horses too diseased to risk, and the fact that a line still existed at all is almost touching. Then the accounts go somewhere worse. Trocolo writes that the starving ate unclean things and lists them, and continues, in a sentence he must have known would outlive him by centuries, to say that some stole children and ate them. Reports of the same act, humans eating humans, appear independently across the famine zone, from Livonia on the Baltic in 1315, from England in 1316, from Poland and Silesia in 1317, where one account describes hanged criminals cut down from gallows for food. From Ireland comes the most explicit passage of all, a chronicle reporting people so destroyed by hunger that they took bodies from graves and dug the flesh out of the skulls and ate it, and that women ate their own children. Each of these is a chronicle report written at some distance by men for whom cannibalism was also the ultimate rhetorical measure of catastrophe, and historians handle every one of them with tongs for exactly that reason. What can be said is this: multiple writers, in different countries, in different languages, who never coordinated anything, all reached for the same unthinkable act to describe what their own region was living through. Whether every specific story happened as written, the people writing them believed their world had arrived at the place where such things happen. You can decide for yourself what weight to give that. The children appear in the record in other ways too, quieter ways. Sources speak of children abandoned during these years, left at church doors, left at the gates of monasteries, or simply left, turned loose by parents who could not feed them, to beg or wander or die. And folklorists have long noticed that the story of Hansel and Gretel, two children taken into the forest and deliberately lost there by parents facing famine, carries the memory of exactly this practice, whatever else the tale became later. From the other end of life, chroniclers mention old people who refused food, deliberately, voluntarily, starving themselves out of the household count so that the working generation and the children might get through. No monument stands anywhere for those grandparents. A line or two in the sources, and the act itself, done in tens of thousands of households facing the same shrinking pot, an entire generation quietly excusing itself from the table. Everything now hinged on the harvest of 1316, and the harvest of 1316 failed too. The rains returned, the second summer drowned like the first, and this is the point where a disaster became the Great Famine. A population can improvise its way through one lost year, reserves, borrowing, charity, the slaughter of animals. 2 lost years in a row hit a population that had already spent every one of those cushions. The winter of 1316 into 17 was the floor of the whole catastrophe. And it is the winter brother Jake was working through with his cart at the top of this video. Ypres lost that tenth of its people in 6 months. Bruges, richer and better provisioned, buried thousands of its own. Towns died faster than countryside during these months. Townsfolk grow no food at all and starve the moment the market does, and the Flemish cities, the most urbanized corner of northern Europe, became the epicenter. The dead in the streets of Ypres were largely villagers who had walked in, plus the urban poor whose wages had become confetti. And the city's response, the carts, the hired collectors, the paid mass burials, was the response of a competent government doing everything a government could do in the 14th century, and it amounted to logistics for corpses. Starvation itself, as a way to die, went like this. A starving body eats itself in sequence. Fat first, then muscle, and you can watch the process from outside as faces hollow and limbs turn to sticks, while, in the later stages, bellies and ankles swell with fluid. A body without protein can no longer hold water in its vessels, and that swelling is why chronicle after chronicle describes the famine dead as bloated, swollen in the streets, which confused observers who expected the starving to look empty. The immune system disintegrates. Wounds stop healing, skin flakes and cracks and darkens. Hair falls out, and a fine downy fur sometimes grows in its place as the body makes a last attempt to insulate itself. The heart, a muscle like the others, wastes along with everything else, and shrinks, and eventually stumbles. The mind goes early and goes badly, as a brain starved of glucose loses inhibition and judgment, and the sources describing famine crowds describe something feral and terrified. Food riots, granaries stormed, bakers' carts stripped in the open street, neighbors informing on neighbors over a hidden sack of barley. Hunger at that depth is not ennobling, and medieval writers did not pretend otherwise. It dismantles people, body first or mind first, and either way it usually finishes the job through some final infection that a fed body would have shrugged off in a week. Which points at the other half of the death toll, the diseases that ran through the weakened population and finished what the hunger began. The Lanercost Chronicle in the north of England records such mortality of men from famine and pestilence together as no one living had ever heard of. Dysentery tore through communities eating spoiled grain and drinking foul water, and dysentery in a starving body is a fast, filthy, dehydrating death. Typhoid followed the same routes. Something the sources call a foul throat infection with high fever swept through, alongside the pneumonias of every winter, alongside erysipelas, alongside anthrax, picked up from the diseased cattle people were increasingly desperate enough to butcher and eat. Historians who study the period generally decline to separate the starvation deaths from the disease deaths, on the sensible grounds that the famine caused both. The combined toll across Northern Europe lands, by the standard modern estimates, somewhere between 5 and 12% of the entire population dead in about 3 years, with something near 10% as the common central figure, and pockets far worse. English royal records of all things let us measure the damage another way, given that the crown tracked its own extended family obsessively. People in that best-fed sliver of society, born before 1276, could expect around 35 years of life. For those born into the famine generation, the figure drops below 30. When the catastrophe reaches deep enough to shorten the lives of princes, the numbers for the cottagers underneath them do not need spelling out. Recovery should have started with the harvest of 1317, and the weather did finally relent that summer. But famines have a cruel momentum, and this one had one more blow queued up, aimed at the animals this time. A cattle plague had been moving west across Europe for several years, out of Central Europe, through Bohemia and the German lands, through the Low Countries, and in the spring of 1319 it crossed into England, most likely walking off a ship at Essex inside some infected beast. Modern veterinary historians studying the descriptions think it was rinderpest, one of the most lethal cattle diseases that has ever existed, a virus that in an unexposed herd approaches total mortality. The medieval sources did not need the name. They described what they saw. Cattle streaming from the eyes and muzzle, scouring, staggering, dying in days. Whole herds going down one animal after another until the byre stood empty. Trocolo, still keeping his record at St. Albans, calls it a pestilence of cattle such as had never been seen before. Another chronicler adds a detail with real horror in it. Dogs and ravens that fed on the carcasses swelled up and dropped dead themselves, so people learned to bury the dead herds untouched, mountains of meat, in a country that had just spent 3 years starving, ploughed under as poison. The numbers, reconstructed from manor accounts, which tracked livestock the way banks track money, are annihilating. Across England and Wales, roughly 6 in every 10 cattle died within about 18 months. On some estates, the accounts record the herd going from dozens of animals to none at all, a written 0 at the bottom of the column. The royal manor of Clipstone held around 186 cattle and oxen in 1317. By 1320 it held 64, half of those sick. The Bishop of Winchester's estates, among the best-run agricultural operations in the country, lost more than half their cattle in a single accounting year. And for the smallholder with 2 oxen, the estate accounts have no line, but the logic is simple and terrible. A dead ox meant no plough. No plough meant land unploughed, or a family harnessing itself to dig by spade. And people did exactly that. Husbands and wives in the traces, working land by hand at a fraction of the pace, in bodies already wrecked by 3 years of hunger. Milk vanished from the diet of the poor along with the cows, and milk, cheese, and butter had been the main animal protein most peasant children ever got. Rebuilding the herds took more than a decade, and while a horse disease the sources call glanders killed off a great share of the horses around 1320 as well, closing off the other source of draft power, the whole of the 1320s in Northern Europe played out in the long grey shadow of the famine, a landscape of weakened people, empty byres and debts, waiting, though nobody knew it, for the pestilence of 1348 to arrive and find them like that. Alongside the famine hunger, medieval winters carried a horror all their own, one that came out of the bread itself, and it may be the single most nightmarish thing in this whole video. It was called Holy Fire, or St. Anthony's Fire, and for centuries nobody had any idea what caused it. Rye was the bread grain of the poor across huge stretches of Europe, hardier than wheat, willing to grow on sand and in cold. And rye, in wet years, plays host to a fungus called ergot, which replaces individual grains in the ear with hard purple-black spurs. Milled into flour, baked into bread, the spurs came right along, and they are saturated with alkaloids chemically related to modern vasoconstrictor drugs, antilysergic acid. The very substance, in fact, from which a Swiss chemist first synthesized a famous hallucinogen in the 20th century. Medieval families in a bad winter were eating, in their daily bread, a compound that clamps blood vessels shut and unhinges the mind, and the wetter the year, the more ergot in the rye, so the poison peaked precisely when people were hungriest and least able to throw away suspect flour. The poisoning took two forms, depending on dose and luck. The gangrenous form began with tingling and a sensation of cold in the hands and feet. Then the sensation reversed into burning, an internal fire in the limbs that gave the disease its name, agony without any wound to explain it. The alkaloids were strangling the blood supply. Deprived of blood, the flesh of the extremities began to die while its owner watched. Toes and fingers darkened, feet darkened. The dying tissue dried, hardened, blackened, mummified on the living body, and then, at the boundary between dead and living flesh, the limbs simply detached. Contemporary accounts describe limbs falling away without a wound, feet coming off at the ankle, a man losing a leg at the knee and surviving, and one of the recorded horrors of the epidemics is sufferers carrying their own detached limbs to the shrine of Saint Anthony as offerings. Chronicles from the outbreak years describe the sick gathered at churches, the smell of the rotting extremities, the survivors crawling on stumps. The convulsive form was its own separate nightmare, violent seizures, twisting spasms of the muscles, a crawling sensation under the skin like insects moving in the flesh, and hallucinations, visions, terrors, madness, entire villages, in the worst outbreaks, seeing things that were not there and screaming about them. And later historians have wondered about a few witch panics in ergot country for exactly that reason. The outbreak record goes back deep into the early Middle Ages. Along the Rhine in 857, a chronicle records a great plague of swollen blisters that consumed people with a loathsome rot, their limbs dropping off before death. In Aquitaine in 944 and 45, an epidemic of the fire killed on the order of 20,000 people. Around 994, another wave in France killed tens of thousands more, and a French historian described it as a plague of invisible fire that tore through the region, flesh consumed from the bone as if burned in secret. Through the 1090s, the fire came in waves along the rye belts, and it kept coming back for centuries wherever wet summers met rye flour, always hitting the poor who ate the rye, and always in winter and spring, when the contaminated harvest was ground and eaten. The church built an entire institution around the disease. The Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony, founded around 1100 at Grenoble, after a nobleman's son survived the fire, grew into a network of some 400 hospitals across Europe dedicated to these patients, and in France such houses were known, with awful directness, as hospitals of the dismembered. The brothers could offer clean beds, care for the stumps, and bread baked from wheat rather than rye, and that last one, unknowingly, was the actual cure, since patients taken off the poisoned flour sometimes stabilized. People credited the saint. The remission, pilgrims noticed, often began on the journey to the shrine, which makes perfect sense once you know the poison stayed home in the family flour barrel. And the family kept eating from that barrel all winter. And perhaps the hardest part of the whole subject is that nobody knew. For something like 8 centuries nobody knew. And parents fed the bread to their children with their own hands. Ergo was the most theatrical of the winter's food poisons, but the quiet ones did steady work alongside it. By the far end of winter, months without anything green, the poor were sliding into scurvy, and skeletons from medieval cemeteries in the alpine lands carry its signature in the bones of small children, especially dated to exactly the season you would guess, the end of winter, when no fresh food existed for anyone. Scurvy starts as exhaustion and aching legs and gums that bleed at a touch. Teeth loosen and drop out. Old healed wounds, years old, reopen. The body can no longer maintain its own scar tissue, and that detail unsettled people at the time as much as it unsettles you now. Bruises bloom from nothing. Given long enough, hemorrhage or heart failure ends it. Most medieval cases never got that far. Spring greens arrived and pulled people back from the edge every year without anyone understanding why, but the last month of a long winter was, for the poorest households, a slow slide into the early stages of a deficiency disease, on top of the hunger, on top of the cold, and the nettles and wild garlic of March were not a foraged garnish. They were medicine, and country people gathered them with an urgency we have entirely forgotten. Medicine had a theory for all of this, and following it for a minute shows you the winter from inside a medieval head. Learned physic ran on the humours, and winter was the season of cold and wet, the reign of phlegm, so the whole prescriptive literature of the era, the regimens of health written for anyone who could afford a doctor, agrees on the winter program. Eat hot, dry foods, roasted meats, strong wine, pepper and ginger if your purse ran to spices. Avoid cold, moist things, most fruit, most fresh vegetables. Genuinely unfortunate advice to hand a population sliding towards scurvy. And one of history's small bleak jokes at everyone's expense. Keep the body warm, keep the feet dry, bathe rarely, sleep long. Some of it, the warmth, the fat, the long sleep, was sound survival doctrine dressed in Greek theory. None of it touched the actual killers. Against pneumonia, the doctors had bleeding, poultices and prayer. Against typhus, nothing at all. Typhus, name it plainly, was a disease built for the medieval winter. The disease travels in body lice, and body lice thrive on people wearing every garment they own for months, unwashed, packed together for warmth in shared beds and shut rooms. Every strategy the poor used against the cold was a strategy for the louse. Fever, then a rash spreading from the trunk, then delirium, with death in the second week for a large share of the sick, then the same again in the next bed as the lice left the cooling body for the warm ones beside it. Jails incubated it, armies incubated it, and the crowded winter cottage incubated it on a smaller scale every year. One more resident of the season, sleeping in the household's clothing, waiting for the cold to gather everyone close. Hunger of that depth did not confine itself to people, and this next part of the story is the one that sounds most like a campfire tale, right up until you look at who wrote it down. In hard winters, the wolves came in. Wolf populations across medieval Europe were enormous by modern standards, and in ordinary times wolves and people kept a wary distance, the wolves taking sheep and the people paying bounties and setting traps. A brutal winter rearranged that arrangement. Deep snow and frozen ground starved the deer died or moved, and a starving wolf pack recalculates its risks the same way a starving human does. Villages at the forest edge lost dogs first, then livestock out of the very folds, then, in the worst years, people, travelers on the roads at dusk, children at the woodline, and the pattern repeats across enough regions and centuries that it forms one of the steady background dreads of the whole season. The most famous case unfolded at Paris, of all places, in the middle of the 1400s, and we have it from a source with no interest in fairy tales. The journal of an anonymous Parisian, probably a clergyman connected to the university, who kept a private chronicle of daily life in the city through some of the worst decades France ever experienced. The 100 Years' War had wrecked the countryside around the capital. Fields lay abandoned, villages stood empty, corpses from war and plague and gallows went into the ground shallowly or not at all, and the wolves of the Île-de-France spent a generation learning that human territory was no longer defended, and that human flesh was food. Through the late 1430s, the journal keeps a running count with a kind of numb precision. In the last week of September 1439, he records, wolves ate 14 people between Montmartre and the Porte Saint-Antoine, in the market gardens and vineyards immediately outside the walls. 14 people, in 1 week, within sight of the towers of Paris. Across those years, the count around the city ran to somewhere between 60 and 80 dead. The city's wall circuit had fallen into disrepair, with breaches and unwatched culverts, and the wolves found them, and on the worst nights the animals were inside, in the streets of the largest city in Western Europe, taking dogs, and worse than dogs. The journal keeper records the city's response with the same flatness he gives the weather: watches doubled, bounties posted, and the gates of the cemetery of the innocents shut at night. That last measure telling you exactly what the wolves had been visiting the cemetery for. One animal in particular entered the city's memory by name. The Parisians called him Courteau, bobtail, for his docked or lost tail, and he ran at the head of a pack that people learned to recognize. The journal and the traditions around it credit Courteau's pack with a final rampage in the winter of 1450, when the wolves came through the walls in the cold and killed on the order of 40 people, the victims being the usual ones, the ones sleeping rough, the ones out after dark, the ones too poor to be behind a door. What ended it was the city itself. The Parisians baited the pack, drew the wolves through the streets into the square before the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and closed every exit behind them. Then the crowd killed them, with stones and spears and whatever came to hand, the whole neighborhood participating, a medieval city executing a wolf pack in front of its own cathedral. Courteau's carcass was loaded in a cart and paraded through the streets so that everyone could see him dead, and people turned out for it the way they turned out for the execution of a famous criminal, which, functionally, is what it was. Paris is the celebrity case, but the records of wolf attack in winter run right across the map. French parish registers in later centuries, when record-keeping improves, note burials of people killed by wolves with grim regularity, and the medieval chronicles carry the same events in looser form. A child taken at the edge of the village, a woman attacked gathering wood, travelers set upon in the defiles. Bounty systems operated nearly everywhere. Wolf hunting was a public duty organized at the level of kingdoms, and England pushed the campaign so hard that by the end of the Middle Ages, its wolves were essentially gone, one of the first countries in Europe to manage it, and English shepherds slept easier for it while their French and German counterparts kept the fires up. A detail from the sermon literature stays with me here. Preachers used the wolf at the sheepfold as their stock image of the devil at the soul, and the image worked on medieval audiences with a force we can barely recover. For the people in the pews, it was the actual sound some of them had heard through the wall on a January night, the flock screaming, the dog going out, the thing in the dark that the fire was for. Money changed the experience of winter completely, and even at the top of society the season got its teeth in. Stone castles look magnificent and lived in thermal terms like caves. Stone walls 2 meters thick soak up cold through the autumn and then spend all winter radiating it back into the rooms. Great halls rose 10 or 15 meters to their roof beams, so every fire in them sent its warmth straight up to be wasted on the rafters, and the households below effectively camped indoors. The response was layering, on the walls as much as the bodies. Heavy wool tapestries and hangings went up over the stone every autumn, trapping a pocket of air between cloth and wall, and hangings worked with hunting scenes and Bible stories moved with their owners from castle to castle precisely because they were, before anything else, insulation. Floors got a deep layer of rushes and straw, renewed when it fouled. Window openings, glazed only for the very wealthy, closed with wooden shutters and oiled cloth that traded away daylight for warmth, so a winter room at midday sat in a brown gloom lit by fire and expensive candles. Portable braziers of charcoal moved from chamber to chamber with the family. Beds became rooms of their own, hung with curtains against the drafts, piled with feather mattresses and furs, warmed before entry with hot stones or pans of coals. And the reason medieval nobles slept sitting half upright against pillows had partly to do with medicine, and quite a lot to do with the simple fact of cold air pooling at floor level. The written record from inside those castles occasionally lets slip how thin the comfort ran. Letters complain of ink frozen at the desk, of wine frozen in the jug at table, of frost inside the great hall, glittering on the stone above the fire, of chapels so cold the priest could barely speak the mass. The queens and countesses of the era spent their winters wrapped in ermine indoors, and the surviving household accounts, which list firewood and charcoal deliveries by the cartload day after day, show a heating operation running flat out to achieve what we would consider a badly heated garden shed. Being rich in a medieval winter meant being cold with excellent blankets. Nobody in the era, from the villain to the king, was ever properly warm between November and March, except in one specific circumstance, being packed into a small room with a good fire and a great many other people, which, once you notice it, explains a large amount of medieval social life. It also explains the feasting. Midwinter was, strangely, the season the medieval poor ate best. Slaughter month had filled the larders in November. The brewing was done. The agricultural year had gone as quiet as it ever went, and squarely into the darkest stretch, the church placed its longest holiday, the 12 days of Christmas, from the Nativity to Epiphany, during which custom, and in many manners actual written obligation, required lords to feast their tenants. Manor documents survive spelling these things out, which peasant households were owed bread, ale, and meat at the Lord's table at Christmas, sometimes down to the detail of who could bring a companion, who got seconds, and who was entitled to take leftovers home. Boy bishops, lords of misrule, games, gambling, mumming in disguise from house to house, and eating, above everything eating, at a season when eating well was the whole miracle. None of it was innocent of purpose. The Lord fed his tenants at midwinter, partly because the tenants were the year's labour, and letting them starve was bad estate management, and partly because the whole community was standing at the entrance of the hungry months, and everyone knew some of the faces at the long tables would not be there at Easter. Midwinter feasting, everywhere it appears, from pagan Yule onward, has that structure underneath the holly. Eat now at the turning of the light, while the stores are as full as they will ever be. What is coming after the feast is the gap, and the feast looks the gap right in the eye, and pours another ale anyway. The church ran its own version of winter, and monastic life in the cold months has one detail in it that has always struck me as the perfect miniature of the whole era. A great monastery, for all its wealth, heated almost nothing. The kitchen had fire, cooking required it. The infirmary had fire since the sick would die without it. And beyond those, the entire sprawling complex, church, cloister, dormitory, refectory, contained exactly one warm room, the calefactory, the warming house, where a fire was kept from All Saints, at the start of November until Good Friday. The rule allowed monks in from the cloister to warm themselves, briefly, before returning to work in the cold, and everything else happened in the cold. The offices sung at midnight and before dawn in an unheated stone church, hour after hour, night after night, all winter. The copying work in the cloister walk, open to the weather along one whole side, where the scribe sat with numb hands doing precision penwork and, as we saw, complaining about it in the margins. Chroniclers of monastic life record old monks with chilblained hands wrapped in rags, and the Abbey of Mow in Yorkshire thought the building of its warming house in the 1180s worth recording in its official history. One fire for 100 men counted as an achievement of the age. The austerity was deliberate, cold offered up as discipline. But the accounts of monastic mortality make clear the winter collected from the cloister just as it collected everywhere else. Pneumonia moving through dormitories of elderly men who prayed in the frost at 2 a.m. as a way of life. Those same monasteries, though, were the closest thing the medieval winter had to a safety net, and at the gates of the great houses, the almoner distributed bread, Ale, leftovers from the refectory, sometimes clothing and shoes, to whoever presented themselves, and in winter the crowd at the gate swelled with everyone the season had cut loose. Widows without land, the old without family, labourers with no winter hire, the wandering poor, moving from gate to gate on a circuit of charity that was, for thousands of people, an actual survival strategy with a geography to it. So many miles between reliable handouts, planned like a trade route. Towns organized their own relief. Parish collections, fraternity doles, testament after testament leaving money for bread and fuel for the poor, and the frequency of firewood in medieval charitable bequests tells you exactly what the donors understood about how the poor died. When the charity fell short, the deaths moved into the open. Freezing to death in the street was a familiar urban winter event, familiar enough that city records treat it administratively. The finding of bodies, then burial at parish expense, and one abbey chronicle from a famine winter mentions the poor found dead at the very gate in the morning, having died within reach of the food, in the night, waiting for the door to open. Underneath all the physical machinery of the season, the fuel and the salt pork and the shared beds, ran something harder to document and just as real, the sheer psychological load of medieval winter darkness. And the darkness opens the door to the strangest material in this whole story. At the latitude of northern England or the German plain, midwinter gives you roughly 8 hours of usable light, and for the medieval poor, artificial light was close to non-existent. Candles cost real money. Wax ones were for churches and the rich. Tallow ones stank and were still an expense. And the standard peasant lighting was the fire itself, plus rushlights, dried rushes drawn through waste fat, each giving a feeble flame for half an hour. So the practical dark, the dark in which nothing could be done and nowhere could be safely walked, lasted 14, 15, 16 hours out of every 24 for months. Towns locked their gates at dusk and rang curfew, from the French for cover fire, the hour at which hearths were banked and honest people were expected indoors, and the men of the night watch had the streets to themselves. Outside the walls, night travel simply stopped. The world contracted to firelight, and everything beyond the firelight was surrendered until morning. Winter shaped even what happened to the dead. In the far north and the high country, the ground froze too hard for grave digging, and communities developed the practice of storing their winter dead, coffined in outbuildings, in church towers, under the snow itself, to wait for the spring thaw. So a northern family might pass a month of evenings with a parent lying coffined in the barn, a presence at the edge of the farmyard, until the earth consented to open. In Iceland and Scandinavia, the practice was routine for centuries. Everything about the medieval winter, in other words, pressed people up against death and darkness for a quarter of every year, and the age answered in its stories. Winter was when the dead walked. The oldest layer of that belief rode the storm winds. Across the Germanic and Celtic north, people spoke of a spectral hunt that swept over the land on winter nights, a host of riders and hounds in the sky, and the accounts agree on its season, the dead of the year, the 12 nights of Yule above all. In England, the thing broke into the official record in the year 1127, when the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in its entry for Peterborough, reported that many men both saw and heard a great number of huntsmen hunting, black, huge and hideous, riding on black horses and black goats, with hounds jet black with staring, hideous eyes, and that this went on through the winter nights in the deer park and the woods between Peterborough and Stamford, and that reliable men watched them, and the monks heard the horns blowing in the night. A monastic chronicle, the sober annal of a great abbey, recording that as an event of the year, alongside taxes and the deaths of bishops. Around the same decades in Normandy, the chronicler Orderic Vitalis wrote down a priest's detailed account of meeting the household of Harlequin on a January night, a procession of the tormented dead passing along a road, people the priest recognized, neighbors, knights, clergy, each suffering according to his sins. And Harlequin's name, worn down by the centuries, survives in the word Harlequin, the comedy servant descended at a very long remove from the master of the winter dead. Across the German lands the hunt rode under Woden's older names, or behind the winter hag Berchtesgaden, who was said to travel with the souls of children dead unbaptized, and household custom answered the belief in practical ways, doors barred during the 12 nights, offerings set out, and a firm rule about not answering if something called your name from the dark. Whatever stands behind all this, wind, wolves, hunger dreams, the sound of geese migrating over cloud at night, which some folklorists suggest with a straight face. The belief itself was fully real, held by ordinary sensible people, and it was seasonal. Nobody feared the wild hunt in June. Closer to the ground and considerably more disturbing, medieval England produced a rich crop of stories about the walking dead, revenants, corpses that got out of their graves, and the two best sources bracket the period beautifully. The first is William of Newburgh, a Yorkshire canon writing in the 1190s, a careful, skeptical historian, famous for demolishing the legends of King Arthur as fabrications, in other words, the last man in England you would pick to peddle ghost stories. And in the middle of his sober history of the English kings, William stops and reports, as fact, a series of cases of the dead leaving their tombs, adding that examples were so numerous in his own day that writing them all would be an enormous labor, and that he would confine himself to a few, for warning, the matter being attested by so many trustworthy witnesses. His cases share a pattern. At Buckingham, a dead husband returned by night to the bed of his terrified widow, then troubled his brothers, then the animals of the town, until the neighborhood took to keeping watch in armed groups after dark. The churchman consulted the bishop, who, interestingly, was advised by his clerks that such things happened often in England, and that the customary remedy was to dig the man up and burn him. The customary remedy, an established procedure, in other words, familiar enough that clerks could cite it. This bishop chose a gentler course, an absolution laid in the grave, and the walking stopped. At Berwick on the border, a wealthy man, described frankly as a rogue in life, came out of his grave at night and roamed the streets with a pack of barking dogs at his heels. The whole town shuddered in terror, until the foremost men of the town convened and hired 10 young men to dig him up, dismember the corpse, and burn the pieces, which was done. William adds, with a historian's care for consequences, that a pestilence followed in the town anyway, and that many believed the dead man's wanderings had poisoned the air. His grimmest case is the one later writers nicknamed the Hound's Priest, a worldly chaplain buried at Melrose Abbey, who rose to hover, groaning, at the bedchamber of the lady he had served in life. A monk of the abbey stood watch over the grave at night, and when the thing came at him, he struck it with an axe, and it fled. And at dawn the brothers opened the grave and found the corpse lying in it with the fresh axe wound in its body, and the grave, William says, wet with blood. They carried it out beyond the walls, burned it, and scattered the ash. The last one, at Alnwick Castle, was a jealous husband who died badly, unshriven, after falling from the roof beam where he had hidden to spy on his wife, and who then came out of the ground at night through what the town described as pestilential air, and people began to die, and the town began to empty. Until on Palm Sunday, 2 brothers whose father the plague had taken went to the cemetery with spades, opened the grave, and found the corpse gorged, swollen, its face florid, its shroud wrecked, and when one of them struck the body with the sharp edge of his spade, there flowed out, William writes, such a stream of blood that they understood it had been filling itself with the blood of the living. They dragged it out of the churchyard, built a pyre, and the account preserves one last physical detail. The body would not burn until they had torn the heart out. Then it burned, and the pestilence in Alnwick stopped. You can hear in all of that the entire later architecture of the European vampire, the blood, the swollen corpse, the stake and the fire, assembled complete in the north of England, 600 years before Dracula, and reported by a historian who prefaces it by saying he knows how it sounds. 2 centuries later, the tradition was still alive in the same Yorkshire hills, and this time we have it from the inside. Around the year 1400, an anonymous monk at Byland Abbey filled some blank pages at the end of a manuscript with a dozen local ghost stories, in rough Latin, clearly taken down from the talk of the countryside around him, and rediscovered and published by the scholar M. R. James in the 1920s. They are unpolished, local, and deeply strange. A man carrying a sack of beans on the road at night is followed by something like a horse, which becomes a rolling bale of hay with a light in the middle of it, which becomes a dead man, who, when conjured in God's name, speaks, names himself, explains the wrong he needs set right, and is helped, and rests. A tailor named Snowball, coming home across the moor, is attacked by a raven with sparks streaming from its sides that strikes him to the ground, and it becomes a dog in a chain, and it is the spirit of an excommunicated man who begs the tailor to buy him absolution, and the tailor, terrified half to death, actually does it, travels, pays the fees, sees the paperwork done, and comes back to the same spot by night to tell the ghost it is free. Another of the 12 concerns the concubine of a dead canon, whose corpse would not stay down and went after the woman herself, and in the struggle, the account says, it gouged her eye. And the collection's most physical entry describes a dead man's body watched over in the church at night, rising against the young man set to guard it, wrestling him, being struck, and when the grave and coffin were opened afterward, the marks of the fight were on the corpse. The Byland stories were written by a monk about his own neighbours, full of local place names you can still visit: Ampleforth, Gilling, the roads between, and they show you what the people of one Yorkshire valley on winter nights around 1400 believed was moving on those roads after dark. Named dead men with unfinished business, physically strong, out there between the villages in the long nights, waiting for someone to pass. And then everyone got up in the morning and went back to threshing. Fear of the dark had company, since the hard winters also broke down the living order in ways the court records preserve in bulk. Crime tracked the price of grain with almost embarrassing precision. Historians who have counted prosecutions across the famine years in England found theft cases surging as bread went out of reach, and the character of the theft tells its own story. Food, overwhelmingly, grain from barns, bread from windows, livestock from folds, and the poached deer and rabbits we have already met. Gale delivery rolls from the famine years show juries doing something quietly remarkable, acquitting at unusually high rates, or valuing stolen goods just under the threshold that carried hanging, 12 pence, so that a starving man who took a sheep worth 2 shillings might find the jury solemnly agreeing it was worth 11 pence. And everyone in the room knew what was happening, and the man kept his neck. Mercy through perjury, applied by neighbours who understood that the next hungry defendant might be them. The system bent that way often, and it also, plenty of times, did not bend, and men hanged in famine winters for the theft of food, on gallows watched by crowds as hungry as the condemned. Highway robbery bloomed in the same seasons. Desperate men with nothing left form bands, and the roads between towns in the famine years became dangerous in ways the sources complain of bitterly. Travellers stripped of everything, food convoys attacked, royal purveyors, the crown's own grain buyers, robbed of the carts they were bringing to supply the king's household. Coastal communities took it out on shipwrecks, plundering anything the winter storms drove ashore, and wreck law. The tangle of rules about who owned a cargo cast up on the beach has whole chapters written into it by hungry parishes stripping ships before the Lord's officers could arrive. And within villages, the pressure found the weakest seams. Accusations flew in hungry years, over hoarding, over hidden grain, over the neighbour whose family looked suspiciously well-fed, and manorial courts filled with defamation cases and brawls that trace one after another back to food. A community that sails through an ordinary winter on cooperation, shared ploughs, shared ovens, lent tools, watched each other's children, could turn in a terrible one into a box of strangers, counting each other's meals. The famine sources from Flanders include town ordinances against grain hoarding with penalties attached, and searches of private houses for concealed stores. Town sergeants going room to room in Ypres and Bruges, looking under the beds of burghers for sacks of wheat, while the carts went round for the dead. Both of those things were the same government responding to the same winter, and honestly, both were reasonable. High Country got its own specialized catalogue of winter deaths, and mountain communities lived with hazards the lowlands never had to think about. Avalanches took travelers on the passes, took pack trains, took whole hamlets sighted one generation too optimistically under the wrong slope, and alpine parishes kept memorials of slides that erased families in one noise in the night. Villages snowed in for weeks fell back entirely on what stood inside their own walls, and mountain sources describe winters where the dead of the season, from illness, from age, from accident, accumulated in the church until the passes opened, the community living below its own coffined winter losses stacked in the tower. Along the advancing glaciers of the later period, the ice itself became the enemy, and alpine records preserve the slow-motion loss of fields, then barns, then houses to glacier fronts that moved a few dozen meters a decade, close enough to watch, slow enough to argue about, unstoppable either way. And parishes near the ice eventually organized processions to the glacier's edge to pray against its advance. Entire villages walking out to confront a wall of ice with a cross and a litany, which as responses to climate change go, is at least more dignified than most of ours. War, when it overlapped with winter, produced some of the cruelest documented scenes of the entire era, and one of them belongs in this video even though everyone in it was put in their situation by other men rather than by the weather alone. Sieges did not pause for the season. An army that had invested a town in autumn often sat down to starve it through the cold months. And inside the walls, the whole calendar of famine we have walked through played out in fast forward, stores, then horses, then dogs and cats, then rats, then leather boiled soft, while winter worked on the defenders from above. During Edward III's siege of Calais, which ran through the whole winter of 1346 into 47, the town's commander made the decision that siege commanders had been making since antiquity, and expelled what the chronicles call the useless mouths, the old, the sick, the women and children who could not fight, hundreds of them, put out of the gates to save food for the garrison. In some tellings, the English king fed that first crowd and let them pass, and in the accounts of a later expulsion, the besiegers refused, and the expelled were left in the ditch between the walls and the siege lines, belonging to nobody, in winter, where they starved and froze in full view of both sides, appealing to two armies that each insisted they were the other's problem. Chroniclers on both sides recorded it, with varying degrees of discomfort, and it happened at other sieges in other winters too, often enough to have a routine quality in the sources, which may be the worst thing about it. The season was the weapon. Cold and hunger did work that no commander had to order directly, and everyone involved understood the mechanism perfectly and let it run. Winter garrison life killed quietly, even without a siege, and the pay records of border castles, the accounts of places like Berwick that we met boiling its dead horses, carry a constant winter attrition. Men struck off the rolls dead of sickness at a trickle that adds up across the cold months to more names than most skirmishes cost. Sentries on open wall walks through northern nights, sleeping quarters that were stone boxes, rations that shrank as the supply roads worsened, and the same lice and fevers as the cottages concentrated. Medieval military manuals advise straightforwardly against winter campaigning, and medieval commanders kept doing it anyway, reasoning that an enemy who believes no one moves in January is an enemy worth surprising, and the men in the ranks paid the difference between those two sentences. And then, every year, for everyone still alive, whatever the winter had been, it ended. The ending had its own rituals and its own bookkeeping. Candlemas at the start of February marked the turn, the blessing of the year's candles at the moment the light began visibly returning, and weather proverbs attached themselves to the day in every language. A bright Candlemas meaning more winter to come, the ancestor, by a long and winding descent, of the groundhog. Lent arrived with its fasting just as the larders emptied anyway, and I have always suspected the fit between the church's season of self-denial and the actual gap in the food supply was less than coincidental. A scarcity that would have happened regardless, given shape and meaning, made voluntary an appearance, a mercy of a sort. Then Easter, and the animals turned out to grass, staggering, blinking, the surviving cattle so weak after the stall months that in the far north neighbors gathered to carry the cows out to the fields, an actual custom with a name, and the first milk, and the eggs that had returned with the light, blessed and eaten. Communities counted themselves. The parish register where such things were kept showed the winter's subtractions in a column, and the survivors sowed the spring grain over the same weeks they buried the last of the winter's dead in ground that had finally softened enough to take them. The stored coffins came down from the towers. Weddings that custom had postponed through Lent came in a rush after Easter. Within a month, the whole cycle was visibly turning toward the next November, the calves and lambs of the new season already earmarked in their owners' heads for the next blood month, and nobody found that thought grim. It meant the system was working, which most years it did. Most years. Everything in this video came from the years it didn't. For the last stretch of this video, follow the cold to its logical end, the place in the medieval world where winter finally won outright. And to get there we go north, far past everything we have talked about, out across the top of the map. Medieval Europe's northern edge was a chain of settlements strung into the Atlantic, Shetland, Faroe, Iceland, and at the far end of the chain, Greenland, and the whole chain existed on the sufferance of the sea ice. Iceland's medieval annals track the ice the way other chronicles track kings, noting the years the drift ice came early, came heavy, locked the fjords. Ice years were hunger years, the ships could not come in, the fish moved, the hay failed, and Iceland's famines, and it suffered brutal ones, ride the ice years like a graph. As the climate turned after 1300, the ice years came more often, and the seaways that had knit the North Atlantic together in the warm centuries began closing. Sailing directions preserved in Icelandic texts record the old route to Greenland, straight west from Iceland, being abandoned in favor of a long southern loop, the direct way now carrying ice even in summer. The map was tightening, and at the far end of it, a small Christian nation of farmers was about to be pinched off from the world. The Norse had come to Greenland around 985 in the warm centuries, behind Eric the Red, an Icelander exiled for killings, who named the place Greenland. the sagas cheerfully admit as marketing to draw settlers. And the pitch was not entirely a lie then. Deep fjords in the southwest sheltered pockets of grazing land, and the settlers built a genuine European society on them, the eastern settlement in the far south with a few thousand people at its height, the western settlement smaller and further north near modern Nuuk, farms, churches, eventually a cathedral at Garda with a bishop, tithes flowing to Rome, paid in walrus ivory. For 3 centuries they raised cattle, sheep and goats at the edge of the habitable world, mowed hay all summer against the winter, hunted seal in the fjords and caribou on the slopes, and sent hunting parties astonishingly far north for the walrus that paid for everything. It worked. Fragile, remote, dependent on every summer going right. But it worked. While the warmth lasted, the warmth stopped lasting. Studies of the seabed and the ice around Greenland show the cooling arriving through the 12 and 1300s, summers shortening, the sea ice thickening, and at those latitudes the margins were already so thin that a shift a lowland farmer would grumble about was, for the Norse Greenlanders, the difference between a hay barn full and a hay barn half empty, and a half-empty hay barn in a Greenland winter, is a death sentence with a delay on it. The animals lived indoors in stone and turf byres for 8 months of the year, eating hay, and when the hay ran short, the animals starved in the stalls before spring, and a farm that lost its animals at that latitude had no fallback harvest, no market town, no neighboring province to walk to. The colonists shifted their diet as the world cooled, and the shift is written in their own bones, for bone chemistry records what a body ate over its lifetime. Early Norse Greenlanders ate like Norwegians, mostly farm food. The last generations ate like the neighbors they never chose to imitate in any other way. Seal, up to around 4/5 of their diet from the sea. A farming people clinging to cattle as identity while living, in caloric fact, as seal hunters. And they never took the other tools that might have saved them. The toggling harpoon for hunting seal at breathing holes through the winter ice, the skin boats, the ways of the Thule Inuit, who were expanding down the coast in exactly these centuries, superbly equipped for the cold that was coming. 2 peoples shared that enormous island as the ice grew. One had the technology for it, the other had a cathedral. What the end looked like, in one place at least, archaeology has recovered in awful detail. The western settlement, the smaller, more northerly, more exposed of the 2, went silent around the 1350s. A churchman named Ivar Bardason sent up the coast from the eastern settlement in those years to investigate, reported finding no people at all, only cattle and sheep running wild, which the party slaughtered and loaded and sailed home with. No bodies mentioned, no explanation, an entire district simply vacated. Excavations at one western settlement farmstead centuries later filled the picture in. In the collapsed rooms, worked through by archaeologists layer by layer, lay the bones of the household's animals, killed and eaten down to a completeness that speaks its own language. The cattle, eaten. The calves, newborn stock, the entire future of the herd, eaten. The dogs, hunting dogs, herd dogs, animals a Norse farm did not eat, killed and eaten, their bones bearing the marks of the same knives that had jointed the cattle. Ptarmigan bones, hare bones, anything. insect remains preserved in the frozen floor layers let the scientists reconstruct the sequence and even the season. And it reconstructs as a household at the end of a failed year, eating its way through everything alive on the property in winter and early spring, down past every line a farming people draws, and then nothing. Whether the last of them died in those rooms or walked out over the ice toward the other settlement, the site cannot say. What it preserves is the winter itself, the one that finally could not be survived, lying in the floor of the house in layers, dog bones on top. The eastern settlement held on longer, shrinking, and its last appearance in the records of the world has a strange, quiet grace to it. In the year 1408, at the stone church of Hvalsey, whose walls still stand today above the fjord, roofless, a wedding was held. An Icelander named Thorstein Olafsson married a woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir, both of them from a shipload of travellers who had been blown to Greenland years earlier and were still waiting for passage home. The banns were called properly on 3 Sundays. Witnesses attested it all. The Mass was sung, and we know every bit of this because the couple later got back to Iceland, and their marriage documents, drawn up to prove the wedding valid, survive. Letters attached to that little archive mention the state of things in Greenland, and they mention nothing unusual at all. A functioning parish, a functioning church, a wedding like any other. And that is the final documented event of Norse Greenland. After the wedding party sailed, around 1410, no ship that we know of ever brought certain news out of the colony again. The written record simply stops, mid-sentence, on a wedding. Whoever remained in the eastern settlement after that lived and died entirely off the record through the deepening cold of the early 1400s, and study of burials in the churchyards suggests people were still being buried, properly, in consecrated ground, in European clothing, for some decades into that century, dressed in garments cut to the fashions of Europe, hoods and gowns of styles their tailors could only have known from the increasingly rare ships, a community at the end of the world still dressing correctly for a continent that had stopped writing back. And then, at some point in the middle of the 1400s, most likely, the last of them died, or the very last few got out on some unrecorded ship, and 5 centuries of Norse Greenland ended without one line of testimony. When the missionary Hans Egede sailed in from Denmark in 1721, hoping to find the colonists' descendants, expecting lost Christians who needed reteaching, he found the fjords, the ruined churches, the tumbled farms, and the Inuit, who held some stories about the old people, and no Norse at all. Nobody wrote down the end. Writing things down was one of the arts that died there. Somewhere in those fjords, in some winter of the 1400s that has no date, the last person of that whole world got through most of one more cold season, and then didn't, and the snow that fell on the farm that year fell on every year after it, and as far as I can tell, nobody anywhere on earth knew that anything had happened at all. All right, that's where I'll set it down for tonight, at Hvalsey, with the wedding. Thank you for sitting through the long dark with me. Seriously, you're my favorite people on this platform. If it kept you company, a like on the way out does more for the channel than you'd think. And go argue in the comments about which detail you're taking to bed. I already know mine. The inns on the frozen Baltic. Patreon and YouTube memberships fund all of this if you ever feel like chipping in. Links live in the description and the pinned comment. Stay warm out there. keep the fire fed, and I'll see you in the next one.